Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat
Good Shabbos. Baruchim Habaim. Delighted to welcome all of you, wherever and however you're joining us this Shabbat, whether you're here in person or joining us in spirit and on time on one of the other platforms. We share, of course, this Shabbat in the simchas of two of our families as we celebrate Tu B'not Mitzvah tomorrow. And of course, we join together this Shabbat immediately after Veterans Day to recognize and thank our veterans this Veteran Shabbat. We begin our service with the singing of Shalom Aleichem. You'll find it on page 627.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Hasharet, Malachei Eyon, Bimelech Malchei Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Boachem Leshalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Eyon, Bimelech Malchei Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Baruchuni Leshalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Eyon, Bimelech Malchei Amlachim, HaKadosh Baruch Tzedchem Leshalom, Malachei Hashalom, Malachei Eyon, Bimelech Kadosh Baruch Hu.
As those of us who are here will be able to continue on 124, and those of you joining us online will find most of the text on the screen. Stefan and Lisa lead us in this next reading.
We enter this sanctuary to welcome Shabbat. Within these walls, we sit surrounded by numberless generations. Our ancestors built the synagogue as a visible sign of God's presence in their midst. Throughout our long history and our endless wanderings, it has endured, a beacon of truth, love, and justice for all humanity. Its presence guided by our ancestors to lives of righteousness, holding up to them a vision of their truest selves.
Now we, in our turn, come into this sanctuary to affirm the sacredness of our lives. May we enter this place in peace. May holiness wrap around us as we cross its threshold. Weariness, doubt, the flaws within our human hearts, the harshness of the weak, let these drop away at the door. In the brightness of Shabbat, let peace settle upon us as we lift our hearts in prayer.
We continue welcoming Shabbat Lecha Dodi, page 138.
Lecha Dodi
לקראת כלה, פני שבת.
נקבלה Lecha Dodi לקראת כלה, פני שבת נקבלה. שמור וזכור בדיבור אחד, השמיענו אל המיוחד, אדוני אחד ושמו אחד, לשמו תפארת בליתי לה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת לקבלה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. לקראת שבת לכו עיניך, כי מקור הברכה, בראש מקדם נפשך. סוף מעשה במחשבה תחילה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. התעוררי, התעוררי, כי באורך קומי אורי, אורי אורי שיר דברי, כבוד אדוני עלייך נגלה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. בואי ושלום הטרם עלה, קם בשמחה ובצהלה, תוך אמונה עם סגולה. בואי חלה, בואי חלה. לך דודי לקרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה. לך דודי לגרח כלה, בני שבת נקבלה.
On pages 145 and 4, entrances to holiness are everywhere. The possibility of ascent is all the time, even at unlikely times and through unlikely places. There is no place on earth without the presence.
השם רבה, בימיו יברח חירותי וימליך מלכותי, בחייכנו יום אחד ובחייך בית ישראל. בגלה בגלה ובזמן קריב אמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם לעלמי עלמיה יתברך יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שם מרי קודשם בריחו לעילמים כה ברכתה ושירתה תרוש וחתה ונחמתה תמירן ביעלמה ואמרו אמן. Ya ya la 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 la. Ya ya la 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 la. Ya ya la la la. Ya ya la la la. Ya la 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 la. Ya ya la la la. Ya la 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 la. Ya ya la 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 la. Baruch hu et Adonai.
As Bruce leads us now, page 148.
Blessed are you, Adonai, our God of the universe, who speaks the evening into being, skillfully opens the gates, thoughtfully alters the time and changes the seasons, and arranges the stars in their heavenly courses according to plan. You are creator of day and night, rolling light away from darkness and darkness from light, transforming day into night, and distinguishing one from the other. Adonai Tzabaoth is your name, ever-living God. May you reign continually over us into eternity. Blessed are you, Adonai, who brings on evening.
Baruch atah Adonai, hama'ariv aravim.
אהבת עולם בישראל עמך אהבת עמך אהבת תורה ומצוות חוקים ומשפטים אותנו לימדת אותנו לימדת על כן אדוני אלוהינו ושוכבנו ובקומנו נשיח בחוקיך ונשמח בדברי תורתך ובמצוותיך לעולם ועד כי הם חיינו ואורך ימינו ובהם נגי יומם בלילה נגי יומם בלילה ואהבתך תסיר ממנו לעולמים ברוך אתה אדוני אוהב עמו ישראל אוהב עמו ישראל שמע ישראל אדוני אלוהינו אדוני אחד
We continue on page 154. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר הודיע מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובפשקך ובקומך, ושרתם לאות על ידך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ולפי שעריך. תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתם את ארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם. We continue on page 157. Standing on the parted shores of history, we still believe what we are taught before ever we stood at Sinai's foot, that wherever we go, it's eternally Egypt, that there is a better place, a promised land, that the winding way to that promise passes through the wilderness, that there is no way to get from here to there except by joining hearts marching together.
Shamre השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום והעמידנו שומרנו לחיים השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום והעמידנו שומרנו לחיים השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום והעמידנו שומרנו לחיים העמידנו שומרנו לחיים.
Blessed are you, Adonai, guardian of Israel, whose shelter of peace is spread over us, over all your people Israel, and over Jerusalem. Baruch atah Adonai, haporei sukkot shalom aleinu, va'al kol amo Yisrael, va'al Yerushalayim.
ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ביני ובין בני ישראל ביני ובין בני ישראל אוהי לעולם אוהי לעולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם כי ששת ימים כי ששת ימים עשה אדוני השמיים ואת הארץ ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם וביום השביעי שבת וינפש ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם ושמרו בני ישראל את השבת לעשות את השבת לדורותם ברית עולם. Na 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 Adonai na 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 שפתי תפתח na 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 ופי יגיד תהילתך na 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 Adonai na 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 שפתי תפתח na 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 ופי יגיד תהילתך na 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 שפתיי תפתח, ופי יגיד, ופי יגיד תהילתך.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu v'Elohei Avotenu v'Imotenu, Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Elohei Sarah, Elohei Rivka, Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah, Ha'el Hagadol, Hagibor v'Hanora, El Elyon, Gomel Chasadim Tovim, V'Konei Hakol, V'Zocher Hasdei Avot v'Imachot, Umevi Geula Livnei V'Nehem, Leman Shemo Be'ahava, Melech Ozer Moshiach Umagen, Baruch Atah Adonai, Magen Abraham Ve'ezrat Sarah, Atah Gibor Le'olam Adonai, Mechayei Metim Atarav Lehoshia, Mashiv Haruach Umorid Hagashem, Mechalkel Chaim Bechesed, Mechayei Metim Berachamim Rabim, Somech Noflim V'Rofei Cholim, Umatir Asirim, Umekayem Emunato Lishenei Avar, Michamocha Ba'al Giverot, Umidom Elach, Melech Memit, Umechayeh, Umatzmiach Yeshua, V'ne'eman Atah Lehachayot Metim, Baruch Atah Adonai, Mekayeh HaMetim, Atah Kadosh V'Shimcha Kadosh, Ukadoshim B'chol Yom, Yehalelu Hasela, Baruch Atah Adonai, Ha'el HaKadosh.
We continue on page 173. May these hours of rest and renewal open our hearts to joy and our minds to truth. May all who struggle find rest on this day. May all who suffer find solace. May all who hurt find healing on this day. May all who despair find purpose. May all who hunger find fulfillment on this day, and may this day fulfill its promise. Baruch atah Adonai, Mekadesh HaShabbat. Ever-present one, may we, your people Israel, be worthy in our deeds and our prayer, wherever we live, wherever we seek you, in this land, in Zion restored, in all lands. You are our God, whom alone we serve in reverence. Baruch atah Adonai, she'otcha levadcha b'yirah na'avod. God of goodness, we give thanks for the gift of life, wonder beyond words, for the awareness of soul, our light within, for the world around us so filled with beauty, for the richness of the earth which day by day sustains us. For all these and more we offer thanks. Baruch atah Adonai, hatov shimcha ulecha na'eh lehodot.
Shalom Ra, Al Yisrael Amecha, Tasim, Tasim Leolam. Shalom Ra, Al Yisrael Amecha, Tasim, Tasim Leolam. Israel. עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן. עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן. Hey, la 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 עושה שלום במרומה, הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ועל כל יושבי תבל ואמרו אמן ואמרו אמן ואמרו
In the week to come, among those couples who will be observing their wedding anniversaries are Rabbi Jessica and Michael Boralski, Mark and Cindy Holland, Carrie and Susie Silverstein, and Eileen and Jonathan Weedy. Our God and God of the generations before us, we thank you for our sacred heritage of marriage and family life. Throughout history, marriage has been the firm foundation to our people, when we were driven from place to place and when we were at rest and settled. We praise you, O God, for sanctifying your people Israel by the covenant of marriage. We thank you for the fullness of joy of those who are celebrating the anniversary of their wedding in this season. Their lives are blessed with the gift of loving comradeship and of devotion to each other. Their joys are heightened, their difficulties lightened as they face life together. May their companionship continue to bring them strength. May their home be hallowed by your divine guidance. May their lives continue to be enriched by affection and mutual respect. May they be blessed with peace and health and contentment. As together we all say, Amen. And as I continue on page 373, and for those of you online, you'll find the words shortly before you. Let's try page 371. Mishberach avotenu v'imotenu Avram Yitzchak v'Yaakov Sar Rivka Rachel v'Leah Hu yivarech et hacholim. May the one who blessed our ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, bless and heal those of our friends who are ill. Mark Ackerman, Allison Arthur, Joel Barwick, Esther Bat Baracha v'Daniel, Vivian Borkin, Joel Bradley, Martha Brecher, Menachem Ben Perel, Diane Carroll, Kathleen Duplaire, Louis Ferris, Robert Fono, Susie Fono, Greg Garcia, Leah Bat Chaiki Mordechai, Michael Greenfield, Gevura Bat Gidlu Finchas Baruch, Chloe Halperin, Rosalind Halperin, Scott Halperin, Sam Hanna, Catherine Hartnett, Edith Howard, Fred Howard, Carrie Huxley, Mark Niaz, Rachel Kadiaz, Ed Knox, Barbara Lieb, Wendy Mayer, Yosef Raphael Ben Yudit, Zavi Ram, Robert Gold Kravit, Ellen Levin, Lenore Levin, Artie Majeski, Patricia Matchett, Sydney Miracle, Lippin Pinchas Ben Liba Umendel, Jasmine Sandler, Ken Sandler, Floyd Schwade, Ruth Bat Irene Avraham, Gary Shovers, Claudia Steele, Marty Stein, Susie Gigi Stein, Jenny Vergetis, Leo Weinshell, Harav Chaim ben Rachel Leu Tzvi Kohen, Nadiva Zayat bat Ilanu Vinyamin Ber, Shoshana bat Harav Ari v'Shoshana. And to those names, if you have names to add, if you raise your hand and mention the name. And if anybody who is on Zoom wishes to add a name, if you literally, visually, or virtually raise your hand, we'll call on you and you can share that name too. Jim? You have to unmute Jim too.
Melinda Stefanski Collins, and Kate Killebrew, and John Karen.
Okay, and Nadine? Dan?
Darlene Wilkinson.
And I'm looking to see if I see any other hands.
Sherry Melman.
Sherry?
Devorah bat Shmuel v'Chava.
Thank you. And again, we're delighted to welcome Edie Pump back. We're delighted to see you, Edie. Because we are praying on their behalf. May the Blessed Holy One be filled with compassion for their health to be restored, their strength to be revived. May God swiftly send them a complete renewal of spirit and of body. May God grant wisdom and insight to those who bring healing. And may God grant courage and compassion to those whose struggles continue. As together we all say, Amen.
Amen. Sheberach avotenu Bekor habracha leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen. Misheberach imotenu Bekor habracha lamotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shelema, the renewal of spirit, the renewal of body, and let us say, Amen.
With this week's parashah, with this week's Torah portion, which Elliot just happens to be entitled, gotta say it a little louder, Elliot. Absolutely, and she should know this well because she's been studying it for a long, long time. Jacob is on the run, going into exile from his home and his land. He had been to this point, as I've said many times, a little man, a trickster, a flim-flam man, a grifter, a man whom no one, including himself, respected. His grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac had been involved in extraordinary battles, had been touched to the core. Jacob, on the other hand, hadn't really done much of anything. In fact, he'd always been the deceiver. Now he's on the run because he had deceived his father on his father's deathbed, making Isaac think that his brother Esau was there and not Jacob, because Jacob was now stealing his father's blessing. Yet in the chapters of Vayetze, we see a Jacob who begins to change. A Jacob who ultimately discovers that his deceptions, his fleeing, his tricks had to come to an end. He ultimately discovers that he can no longer be just Jacob, son of Isaac, son of Abraham, but someone and something more. No longer will he live down to his name, to Jacob, which means heel, but ultimately live up to his new name, to Yisrael. That change, when Jacob finally surpasses himself and becomes Israel, will be read in next week's Torah portion, which is first read as kind of an introduction on the afternoon of every Shabbat of the concluding one. So tomorrow afternoon, as Loren celebrates becoming Bat Mitzvah, She'll be reading from the beginning of next week's portion, which just happens, Loren, to be called. You got to say it a little louder. It's called Vayishlach. And so she's going to be reading these verses tomorrow as Jacob becomes Israel. So tomorrow morning at our Shabbat morning service, Elliot will be reading the beginning verses of this portion, which tell of Jacob on the run. Verses with Jacob, who through a dream realizes that God was in that place, and he did not know. And then tomorrow afternoon, when Loren is called to the Torah, she will read of a matured and changed Jacob, now Israel. And both of their excellent Divrei Torah will kind of address this man and the changes he goes through. And you're all invited to join us, whether you're here in person or whether you're joining us through one of the other platforms. So in the verses I want to read tonight, Jacob is working hard at becoming a better person. He is now grown and has now become the one deceived. In the process, he's gained 2 wives, Leah and Rachel, and of course their maidservants, Bilhah and Zilpah. Each mother would be blessed with children in just the 12 tribes. And each mother would name each child based on some real-life experiences. So now I'm going to turn to the story in Genesis chapter 29, verses 31 to 35, as Leah gives birth and then names her children. If you want to follow along in the Chumashim, you'll find the Chumashim in the pockets of some of the chairs. If you look around, you'll see them either in front of you, or if you reach behind you, you can pull it out of the pocket of the chair behind you. You'll find me beginning on page 199, page 199 of the Chumashim. Now, seeing that Leah was disfavored, the Eternal opened her womb while Rachel was childless. Leah thus became pregnant and bore a son and named him Reuven, for she said, "The Eternal saw my plight. Yes, now my husband will love me." And she became pregnant again and bore a son and said, "The Eternal heard that I am despised and had given me this one too." So she named him Shimon. And again she became pregnant and bore a son, and she said, This time my husband will be attached to me, for I have borne to him 3 sons. She therefore named him Levi. Again she became pregnant and bore a son and said, "This time I will give thanks to the Eternal." She therefore named him Yehudah. Then she stopped bearing. Leah, the one whom Lavan put under the chuppah in place of Rachel as he deceived Jacob, the one whom Jacob didn't love, the one whose own name connotes weak eyes or weariness and reflects a plainness, is the one who is blessed with 6 of Jacob's 12 sons and his only daughter. But how she yearns for Jacob's love, and how she thinks having children will bring on that love. I meant 4, not 6, I'm sorry. She names her firstborn Reuven from the Hebrew, "Oh, look, behold, a son." She wants God to see her affliction and Jacob to love her. She names her secondborn Shimon from the Hebrew meaning to hear. May God hear her pain and Jacob hear her desire for love. She names her thirdborn Levi from the Hebrew meaning to accompany. With 3 sons already, Jacob should finally accompany her. The first 3 children were given names that she hoped would convince her husband to love her. But the names didn't work. None of these sons bring about the change in Jacob for which Leah yearns. And in reality, none of them become our heroes. Only with the 4th son does change take place. She names him Yehudah, Judah in the English translation, Hebrew for giving thanks. She doesn't expect Judah to bring Jacob closer to her. In fact, she has no conditions anymore. She simply wants to give thanks to God for life. And finally, Jacob begins to understand, to become the person who will be named Israel. And Yehudah, Judah? Judah is the one who grows up to save Joseph and all of the Jewish people. And that's who we're named after. We are all of us Yehudim. We are all Jews. And that's perhaps what it means to be a Jew, to give thanks. And tonight, this Shabbat, as Jews and as Americans, we give thanks to those who have given so much in their service to this land of ours, to those who have protected our freedom, to truly give thanks to our veterans. And so I'm going to turn to the president of our Brotherhood First, Robert Jacobs, who will be with us again on Zoom to introduce our guest speaker this Shabbat Eve. Robert.
I would like to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, Colonel Ann Kanabi, Public Affairs Officer at the Milwaukee VA Medical Center. Colonel Kanabi has an MA from UWM and an MS in National Security and Resource Strategy from the National Defense University. She received her PhD from Marquette University in Public Relations. Colonel Kanabi has been with the U.S. Air Force Reserve for over 30 years, spending 26 years in public affairs. With great pleasure, I would like to introduce Colonel Ann Kanabi, who will speak on Beyond Combat. A question and answer session will follow. I give you Colonel Kanabi.
Hello. Can everyone hear me okay?
And Colonel, I'm going to for those of you who are here in person, we want to be able to see you. We hear you great. We want to be able to see you too. So if any of you need to move to be able to see this screen better, or want to go back further where you'll be able to see them on the TV monitors, or is it up on the balcony too tomorrow? It's not. So don't go up to the balcony if you want to see her more closely, but feel free to move. Colonel, please, it's all yours.
Well, thank you so much. I heard a lot of thank yous there, and I really need to say thank you to this group, this congregation for having me. This is a first for me, so kind of exciting. I'm going to go through a slide deck tonight, and I think they're kind of working to pull that up in the background. But I appreciate you letting me do this via Zoom, because I'm actually leaving tomorrow morning quite early for a little, what I call a mini deployment. I'll be gone for 17 days. And I live out on the west side of Milwaukee, actually west side of Waukesha to be precise. So I just thought it would be kind of a hike to be driving back and forth when I have to get up super early. So thanks for accommodating. So on that note, I'm going to start out and go through some slides that help tell the story, and we'll take questions afterwards. So I'm going to go to the next slide, please. And I hope somebody has the little control button there, because I don't. Maybe I do. Find out. No, I don't think I do. Okay, can someone go to the next slide, please? There we go. Perfect. So before I really begin, I'm going to share a little secret with you. I actually live a double life. And before you start to think, boy, is she a spy? What's going on in the background there? Who did we get here? We'll go to the next slide, and that'll help show a little bit what I've done. Maybe it's a triple life. I'm a working professional. So I'm working at the VA full time. Really neat job. I started there in August. I call myself a gym rat. That's one of the things I really like to do, is go work out in the gym, de-stress. I also like hot yoga. And I'm a mom. That's just one of my kids there. I have two wonderful daughters. So I've got a lot going on. And then we'll go to the next slide. And here comes that double life. In addition to juggling what I just showed you, I'm also an Air Force reservist. We call ourselves citizen airmen. And by that we mean we are in the communities, we're local, and yet we also, contributing to the communities in terms of involvement and jobs and things like that, but then also have this other life external. And one of my favorite general officers that used to head up the Air Force Reserve always talked about being a reservist is like a three-legged stool. You have one of the legs is the family, one is that civilian job, and the third is the reserve. And what he said, if any of those get a little out of whack, it tips over. So it's something that we have to be really careful about and mindful of. So a couple of photos here. I'm going to point out on the photo on the left, if you look at my sleeve there, it's different than what I'm sporting tonight. That's from last spring when I did a couple of months at Space Operations Command, which I'll talk a little bit about. And then also shot from the Pentagon. I spent 7 years there as a reservist living in Wisconsin, but spending my summers going to the Pentagon and often for a month over winter because I taught college and it lent itself. So there it is, double life. Let's go to the next slide. Before I jump in too much about my job, I'm going to debunk or get rid of some myths about the military. I frequently have people that have these assumptions that are not always accurate. So let's go into the first myth we're going to debunk. Next slide. Here it is. Military people can't wait to go to war. That is actually largely a myth. And in fact, my mom years ago had once said that, boy, it was like back in Gulf War I. She goes, well, I know you guys are all like chomping at the bit. I'm like, no, we're not at all. So the reality is the vast majority of us do not want war. And I can't say no one because, you know, that's hard to say. But almost no one, I don't know anyone personally, and I know hundreds, if not thousands of people in the military, and none of us want war. What we really want is stability, and war is always a last resort. By the way, little photo here. That was during training. That is not a loaded weapon. They had to teach us how to use those, carry them and things like that in case we went into a hotspot. And with that particular deployment, I never even once had to check out a weapon. So that's a good news story, but they teach us. Next slide. So another myth. I can't tell you how often people, especially kids, ask me, hey, you're in the Air Force, do you fly a plane? And in reality, there's more than 50 different jobs in the Air Force. Very few people are pilots flying planes, and that number is actually going down. I'm sure you've heard of drones. We call them unmanned aerial systems, and we're seeing more and more use of that and fewer pilots. So only a tiny fraction of the Air Force actually flies those planes. But what I really like to do is mention about all those other different career fields. What they're really doing is supporting the mission. Everybody has a role that supports the mission in the big picture. So myth debunked there. Not everyone flies a plane in the Air Force. Let's do the next slide. And I touched on this earlier. Everyone carries a gun. People think that. Reality, I never carry a gun unless I'm in or out of a place like Iraq or Afghanistan, which I have been into Iraq a couple of times. But it was always typically very in and out, sitting on the plane, picking up patients and things like that. So really in the bulk of the areas that I've served, I've never been carrying a weapon. I should say a gun. And I always say, any guess to my favorite weapon? When I say weapon, we say the pen. You see me there, journalist background, the pen and the sword, they say. Well, we don't have swords, so just the pen. And I guess now we call it laptops, using the words. So next slide. So we're shifting away from the myths, a little bit about my background, where this place called the military has taken me. I started out with a C-130 unit in Milwaukee. A C-130 is a cargo plane. And if you're from the Milwaukee area, you may remember years ago, prior to 2007, we had a C-130 unit that was right near the airport, a reserve unit. There's still a guard unit over there, and they have a type of plane called refueler. So my unit was there. I joined my first year in college. I had a scholarship, academic scholarship, and I dipped right below a B. And that was enough to lose the scholarship. So then I started thinking, boy, what am I going to do? And on the day that one of my friends went to the Air Force Reserve he was checking it out, I was along, and the recruiter said, hey, you'd be a really good medic. Well, here we are more than 35 years later, still in the Air Force. I was prior enlisted, which means I started at the lowest, the most bottom you can go in terms of rank. I went in and they called you a slick sleeve. So you had nothing on your sleeve, even when you got out of basic training. So as low as you can go on the enlisted side of the house, and climbed up 5 steps, became a technical sergeant. And then after I got my degree, I went kind of a different track, what we call officers, and have stayed officer track ever since. Went to Qatar twice for deployments, 05 and 06. And when I was there, we did a number of different missions into Iraq, Africa, even Saudi Arabia, and things like that. So that was pretty darn interesting. In 2005, Katrina, it's actually right before I went on my first deployment overseas, Katrina hit. And I remember hearing about it in a briefing at the base. They said, yeah, I didn't realize what the devastation was, but they said, yeah, it sounds like they're out of power. And I said, hey, if you need anybody to go, I'm around. They might need some public affairs people. And it was right before the semester started. Again, I was teaching college back then, and off I went for Labor Day weekend. It ended up being a week, but that was pretty interesting too. Taking media into Louis Armstrong International Airport, seeing the devastation, but then also seeing just the wonderful good things the military was doing in terms of rescuing people and pulling them out. At that time, only military planes could get into the airport and get really critically ill patients out into the outlying areas where they could get care. So other interesting things, I've done live interviews on TV, radio, CNN. Was the Pentagon spokesperson deployed for this, was based out of DC for Guantanamo Bay War Court. We called it the Office of Military Commissions. So people also often say, were you in the prosecution or the defense? Well, I was neither. I was part of the operating structure of the court and would comment just on what had occurred in court or what was coming up and things like that. I have Kid Rock tour. Kid Rock is a musician, rock star, I guess you would say. They took him on some C-130 aircraft into overseas as a morale tour, along with a comedian named Carlos Mencia and a young artist, Jesse James, a woman up-and-coming artist. And I went along as the public affairs for that. And that was kind of cool too. That's for about 2 weeks. I deployed to U.S. Central Command. Before I get too excited about that, that's based in Tampa, Florida. In fact, one of the previous pictures where I was actually carrying that big gun, that was for that deployment. So that's why I never cracked it out. I was stateside, of course. I was a reservist at the Pentagon for 7 years, which is a great experience, and worked very well with my college teaching because I take summers off and could do a really good chunk of time at working for the Secretary of the Air Force in their Public Affairs Division. And I was the Dean of Students. This was a full-time gig at National Defense University in Washington, D.C. It was the first time in my life where I could use, I always feel like I got 2 different lives going on this. Over here, I had the academia and all this, and over here, I had the Air Force. But it came under one umbrella, and my PhD was put to good use, and so was my colonel rank. Fabulous, fabulous job. Probably the best job I ever had. Having said that, my family was back in Wisconsin, and they asked me to stay an extra year, and I had to tell them no. I said, I got to go home. I got a family, kids and a husband back home. Recently, I referenced this earlier. This was kind of a really cool thing that I did just this last spring for a couple of months. I went and helped with the Space Force, Space Operations Command, to do public affairs. That's the newest branch of the military. It's been around 2 years and hit 2 years in December. And I didn't know much about space at all, but I would say I certainly have an incredible appreciation for it. I was technically backfilling for active duty. Somebody was retiring, and the new person active duty wasn't coming on for a couple of months. They said, can you come in? So I learned a lot in 60 days about how space affects our lives and why it's important and why it's part of our national security. I always think of the 3 C's. It's competitive, and by that I mean different countries are are competing to get up in space. It's congested. There's a lot of stuff floating around. We've had a couple of close calls this year where things, little tiny things have almost, debris have left over from other countries, almost crashed into the, it's different in space, into the International Space Station. So it's competitive, congested, and what was the last one? Competitive, congested, I'll think of it later. But needless to say, space effects and things related to space affects the monetary system, our iPhones, GPS, you name it. Even the weather patterns associated with crops and things like that are looked at from space. So tremendous impact on our lives, which we don't think about a lot. And finally, the last bullet on there, right now what I'm doing, I've been in this role for the last 3 years. I'm an emergency preparedness liaison officer for FEMA Region 5. And so I liaise, exactly what it says. I'm the person communicating through big Air Force, and if there's some sort of emergency on the ground, that the Air Force is involved in any way, I'm sharing that information back and forth. So it's pretty interesting. So let's go to the next slide. It's a little bit about background. So what is an EPLO, the Emergency Preparedness Liaison Officer? You'll hear me say EPLO. EPLO, some people say EPLO, potato, EPLO. And that's exactly what we do. We do that liaising between big Air Force and the lead federal agency, which most times is FEMA during disasters. Right now we're involved in the Afghan evacuee mission. And anytime they're using the Air Force Base, for example, we are involved, people like me are involved, and that's what I'm up to tomorrow. I'm heading to Holloman Air Force Base to liaise between that Air Force Base and big Air Force and pass information back and forth. That mission, by the way, is run by Department of Homeland Security and the State Department, so that federal agency can differ. But in most cases with hurricanes, disasters, we tend to think FEMA. This job I'm in now is, for the first time in my life, is focused on the United States domestically. So I'm really not highly unlikely I would go overseas now. We deal with natural disasters, man-made disasters, anything involving emergency preparedness. And again, when the Air Force is involved, we call it Title 10, and that's talking about reservists and active duty assets. And that's a little bit different. You also heard of GUARD, I'm sure. GUARD, think of it as state run and the governor is in charge. So next slide. Some of our missions. So I guess it's almost 2 years already. I went to Puerto Rico in January of 2020. There was earthquakes down there, pretty common, but some of them got kind of bad. And we had some Air Force assets, Air Force people down there, and wanted to make sure the runways were good and things like that. So I was down there for a couple of weeks. Talk about interesting, just being involved in missions like that. Some of our other missions recently, a lot of stuff to do with COVID. A year and a half ago, when COVID first broke in March, April, May, we really saw these medical response teams that were going, helping out hospitals that, they were in tremendous need for their assistance, things like that. You heard about locally the alternate care site they were building up at State Fair Park, the Javits Center, et cetera. So anytime there was any part of an Air Force person involved, whether it was a team of medics, or broader packages, helping, assisting, and things like that, there was an Air Force person like me to liaise and share information. The whole civil unrest that we saw a little bit over a year ago, first in Minneapolis and Kenosha, if there were Air Force people involved in some way, or we just monitoring it, we were involved from that capacity. And then more recently, the COVID vaccine mission. I remember distinctly a year ago in November, I said to my Air Force boss, I said, hey, somebody asked me if we're going to get involved with the vaccine mission. He's like, oh, no, not at all. Not at all. We're highly unlikely. And by end of January, we were involved in the vaccine mission. And that, of course, was because we had airmen that were doing the vaccinations. And I should mention, even now, some places around the country with the Delta variant bubbling up, we've seen some medical response teams, maybe not so much in the ERs and things like that, but with infusions and those type of treatments that are going on. I already mentioned Operation Allies Refuge and Allies Welcome. That's the Afghan evacuee mission. And then hurricanes. And you might say, boy, you're FEMA Region 5, which is the Midwest. We have no hurricanes here. That our backup region is Region 2, which again is Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands. Air Force has been involved with Hurricane Maria, Ike, Hurricane Florence, Michael, you name it, we're helping out. And then finally, another thing that's constantly on our radar, the EPLOs like me that are out west, it seems like we always have one or two activated for the wildfires that are going on out there. So it's really busy. It's really interesting though, too. Next slide. So besides all these awful disasters and things like that, we do security related events called National Special Security Events. So the Democratic National Convention was supposed to be here last year. As we know, it was modified, scaled down, and virtual, but we're involved in that behind the scenes, even when it went virtual. And I also thought that was interesting because we didn't have all those big speakers here and things like that. By the way, the lead federal agency in that case was Secret Service and FBI and things like that. But I thought it was really odd, that it had scaled down so much. But then I found out later, it wasn't always so much high-level people, but protecting the integrity of the event to make sure that elections, in this case, relating to the DNC, ensuring that would take place. So it's a little eye-opening for me. On the other hand, the Republican National Convention. So these are just some of the national special security events. They call it UNGA, the UN General Assembly, every year, presidential funerals, inaugurations, all that. So we don't take a political stance at all, but we're behind the scenes ensuring security is occurring to keep the integrity of the events. We also have special assessment rated events. You'll hear SEER events. These are things like the Boston Marathon, the Super Bowl, Indy 500, even the Chicago Marathon. And every year there's an I shouldn't say an organization, but a government body that looks at large gatherings and figure out the level or potential security threat this planning team says, and then gives them a number. And then again, we're behind the scenes in case something goes wrong. I should say this really took off after the Boston Marathon. That's really when we started seeing more of this. And in a lot of these cases, liaising with Secret Service, the FBI. Next slide. Oh, here's an example. This is from the DNC. That's one of my coworkers. He's an EPLO from out of state, from Ohio, but he came up to assist as well. So there was always some of us there. And I say interagency. In here, you see a number of different federal agencies and local agencies that was in a broad room. The DCE stands for the Defense Coordinating Element. And that's what Jason and I serve on, and other factors in here. I think the Guard was behind us, the Wisconsin Guard. We also had, FEMA, FBI, Secret Service, etc. Next slide. We also do a lot of disaster planning and call them exercises. Going through drills, what would we do, who would go where, and have a couple every year. We've been doing them more virtually lately because of COVID, but prior to that, a couple times a year, we were actually traveling and figuring out how we would respond and what roles would occur. So prior to this position, I had no clue in the Midwest there was something called the New Madrid Fault. In fact, I corrected a general. I said, I think you mean Madrid, right? And he's like, no, it's New Madrid. I'm like, well, I've never heard of this. And he proceeded to give me a 300-page book talking about it. But there's actually a fault line that goes all the way up into southern Illinois and into Tennessee and areas like that. And they predict, well, actually, they say it's overdue. Every 200 years, supposedly, it shakes. And they say it's overdue. So we do a lot of training for that, at least once a year. Out west, there's another fault line called Cascadia, which is maybe even scarier, and they're both kind of scary, that predicts, like the West Coast parts of California might fall right off, things like that. So that's another one we watch. That's not all happy stuff. Hurricanes are much more routine. Puerto Rico and Virgin Islands on our radar, and we do training for those. We do national military exercises. I was coordinating with FEMA. And then we also train for bad man-made disasters. So kind of an interesting note, while I'm assigned to the Air Force day in and day out, when I'm activated, I'm still an Air Force reservist, but we report to the Army. So the Army tends to be the branch of service in charge, and it's led by a full-time colonel like me, the defense coordinating element. Next slide. So what's this thing called DISCA? It was on the very first slide. DISCA, we talk about DISCA a lot in my world. Again, never heard of this till I was in this job the last 3 years. Stands for Defense Support of Civil Authorities. And the basic tenets of DISCA, it's what we use to frame our response during disasters. It means we start with local assets first in any emergency. And I use an example. Say there was something really big bad that happened in Milwaukee. We're first going to use stuff in the city of Milwaukee. Then maybe we'll go to the county level, and boy, we still can't get a hold of this. It'll go to the state. Then it'll go to the Guard, which is, an extension of the state. And then we're like the last. They really don't go to active duty Air Force and Reserve until they've exhausted all those local assets. Interesting enough, even when you get more and more people involved, the commander is always going to be local. That's what we call incident command system. Part of the reason we use those local assets first is the Department of Defense is really costly. And we also have a rule that we should try to use civilian or commercial assets first. And part of that is to get the economy going again, investing back into the community. One of the things they say in our business is never be late to need. So you don't want to show up late and always being prepared. And that's really the philosophy that underlies all of our work as an EPLO is defense support of civil authorities. Next slide. So go through a couple of highlights here. I mentioned, you can tell it's different timeframes, by the way, because we have different uniforms on. I haven't worn that in many, many years. That was 2005. That's a friend of mine, Steve, who was in the reserve at the time, local guy, long retired, been retired now for almost 10 years, that we were responding to Hurricane Katrina and flying media in and out of that operation zone. Next slide. Oh, a couple of deployments to the Middle East. That's a C-130 in the background, and that's where I'm on the right doing what they call public affairs, PR, and having a pilot talk in front of the plane about whatever they were doing, mission they were flying, probably some sort of transport. It was out in the desert. Next slide. Met a ton of interesting people. This was actually in the Middle East as well, but as you can see, it's a completely different country there. And that's a lot of the coalition, the partnerships and things like that. So it's been quite fascinating. Next slide. This was actually in Africa. I was forward deployed there into Ethiopia. Little adventure, meeting the neighborhood kids. Funny story. Well, it wasn't very funny at the time. the plane broke. Sometimes plane breaks, maintenance, that type of thing. Something broke on the plane. So we were stuck in Ethiopia for a week. And it wasn't really a safe country. So we stayed on a little tiny army compound. And on the right there, I am eating goat meat. Kind of interesting as well, because they were running out of MREs and they wanted to make sure the pilots had the MREs first. But yeah, a great adventure. Next slide. That was into Iraq, Mosul, picked up patients, things like that. I got out of the plane, didn't go any further than that, held the flag up. Next slide. That was in Qatar, a little adventure. That was at the base. You could see on the right there how far we were from all these miles from around the world. Next slide. This was in Guantanamo Bay. So I was based in DC, but I would take media down for the war court. That's where they were holding the sessions. Anytime something big was happening, Carol Rosenberg, who used to be out of Tampa, amazing reporter. Funny thing about her, she knew more than any of the public affairs or military people because she had covered the story for so long. But we had to stay in tents a couple times and the media stayed in tents as well. Next slide. There's your Kid Rock tour with the band of the Air Force Reserve. So, flying into these interesting places. That was in Kirkuk at the time. Next slide. That's when I was deployed to U.S. Central Command in Florida. And as you can see, it was an office building at the Air Force Base there. Next slide. This is the university where I told you I had the most fabulous job for 3 years in Washington, D.C. I had more than half my student body was international students and senior officers from the country. So quite the adventure and learned a lot, met amazing people. And next slide. Oh, this one's out of Puerto Rico. So this is my role as an EPLO. I'm there with Colonel Scott Kadar, who's from FEMA Region 2. He had been down there a couple of weeks, was going back to his civilian job with FedEx, and that's when I came in and took over for him. You can see in the background too, again, the interagency. Next slide. So in conclusion, on this Veterans Day theme, Veterans Week, like to offer a couple of things. Thanks, a veteran. I heard that earlier in your message, and thank you so much for pointing that out. I also want to say thank their family too. I could never do what I do without having a super supportive husband who's not military, by the way, and kids. If you cobble together the last 10 years of my life, I've been gone for more than half that time. So I'm very blessed to have that great support of them. And I think just being mindful, there's citizen airmen, soldiers, and sailors living among us. Even here in this community, you don't see them in their uniform all the time, but they're wearing multiple roles. They're living double lives and things like that. So more than 35 years of service. And I think I do a lot of thinking about this every year around Veterans Day. Just the incredible people that I've met, the amazing things they're doing to make the world a better place. And I'm now in that twilight of my career. So I'm really reflecting a lot. I mean, 35 years is a long time, but I still think there's no greater honor than now to carry extend this service in the military, and now to be working at the VA and giving back to the veterans there is just as simply as exciting. So thanks for listening, and I will now take your questions.
Bob, Robert, are you there? And Colonel, thank you for tonight, of course.
You bet.
We'll take, again, I'm not coordinating this online, take a couple of quick questions if we can. So I'm just looking here, and Robert, are you checking whoever is handling Zoom online to see if there's some questions? All right, so I need to see somebody from Brotherhood there. Robert, can we bring you back up on the screen?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, Robert. Now I can see the screen. If any of you have questions, if you'd visually or virtually raise your hand.
I see a hand.
Yes, Jim, go ahead. And again, as quickly if you can, as direct the question.
A while back, there was a program offered, I think, through county agencies or districts in Wisconsin with what was called the CERT program, Civilian Emergency Response Team, and they offered some training. But I think it may have been discontinued, at least in the Milwaukee area, with what's been going on, because they haven't offered courses or anything for a long time that I've been aware of. Is there anything that you're aware of on that score?
Well, you know what? Something's wrestling in the back of my head, but I can't put my finger on it because something about that acronym. So there might be elements out there. What I can tell you is you can take a lot of FEMA courses online. They're free. We're required to do it for our job, periodically take them online. But if you go to the FEMA website, you can take them, and there's a lot about this incident command, emergency response, and things like that. You may also want to check with, now I don't know if you guys are Milwaukee County or.
Yes, we are,
Yeah.
Milwaukee County.
You might even want to just check with the county and see what they have going on. There's always training. They may not be publicizing it as much, but there's always training going on and a lot of online stuff. I know another way that I've seen civilians get involved is with NGOs, non-government organizations, volunteer capacities, Red Cross and things like that. And even those people take these emergency response courses. So I hope that's helpful.
Well, I'll have to try to look into it, to see if anything's been continued or replaced in that line, because it was interesting, a lot of training, including how to be part of a team, doing search and rescue and building damage,
yeah.
all kinds of firefighting, you name it. Anything from very little into, and how to be someone could be an initial on-site incident response coordinator until someone with more training as part of an agency could. So it was really an interesting concept.
So a couple of things you mentioned, search and rescue is done by Civil Air Patrol. That's one of the many. And that's an organization that anyone can get involved in, any adult, or I think even have kids that are like, I used to think of it as like very old, retired Air Force people that wanted to stay in touch, and then very young kids in high school. But there's a whole, I guess I didn't even get into that, but I do work a lot with Civil Air Patrol. Early on with the vaccine distribution, we use Civil Air Patrol to get into some of the Native American Indian reservations. When they were like trying to distribute it real quickly because it had a short shelf life and things like that. So Civil Air Patrol, and then also volunteer fire departments and things like that. Good question.
So, Jim, thank you for your question. Colonel, I'm going to thank you again. We hope you can stay with us a little longer. There might be some questions when we finish at the end too. So again, my deepest thanks. Our thanks to you. Our thanks to our Brotherhood for arranging this Veteran Shabbat. And again, we wish you much success on this deployment, and of course, we want you to return safely home too. With that, we continue with, thank you. All right, we continue with Aleinu. You'll find it on page 586, as Together We Rise.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית, שלא עשנו גגאי הארצות, ולא שמנו במשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומשה מקרוב בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו בגובה מרומים. הוא אלוהינו אינו, אמת מלכנו אמת זולתו, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת היום לחשבות אל לבביך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל, ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד.
As Seth will lead us to the bottom of page 588, and Gary here in person on page 590.
Okay. We therefore hope in you, Adonai our God. May we soon behold the glory of your might, sweeping away the false gods of the earth, that idolatry be utterly destroyed, perfecting the world under the rule of God, that all humanity invoke your name, turning all the wicked of the earth toward you.
Let all who dwell on earth acknowledge that unto you every knee must bend and every tongue swear loyalty. Before you, Adonai our God, let them pay homage. Let them give glory to your honored name. Let all accept the yoke of your reign. And you may rule over us soon, forever and ever. For sovereignty is yours, and to all eternity you will reign in glory, as it is written in your Torah. Adonai will reign forever and ever. Thus it has been said, Adonai will become sovereign of all the earth. On that day, Adonai will become one, and God's name will be one.
ונאמר היה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
It seems appropriate this Shabbat before Kaddish to read these words of poetry by a veteran of World War I who also served during World War II as Librarian of Congress. These words by Archibald MacLeish, inscribed on the World War I memorial in Washington, D.C. The young dead soldiers do not speak. Nevertheless, they are heard in the still houses. Who has not heard them? They have a silence that speaks for them at night and when the clock counts. They say, we were young, we have died, remember us. They say, we have done what we could, but until it is finished, it is not done. They say, we have given our lives, but until it is finished, no one can know what our lives gave. They say, our deaths are not ours, they are yours, they will mean what you make them. They say, whether our lives and our deaths were for peace and a new hope or for nothing, we cannot say. It is you who must say this. We leave you our deaths, give them their meaning. We were young, they say, we have died, remember us. As the names of your dear ones are mentioned, we invite you to rise in their loving memory as we remember the relatives and friends of our congregation who have gone before us into life eternal. We remember tonight the names of Barbara Lupu, Eileen Lux, Doran Danny Gendelman, and Helga Levings, who were laid to rest recently. We remember also the names of Jacob Beck, Pearl R. Becker, Abel D. Burkhoff, Ida Berman, Paul Bomberg, Nathan Borazak, Robert Charney, Natalie Clinton, Albert A. Cohn, Albert J. Cohn, Charles T. Cohn, Victor Elkanan, June Ann Formiller, Abraham Franklin, Milton B. Garner, Ethel Garish, Leah Glass, Friedel Haas Goldschmidt, Richard Halpern, Daisy Hauser, Belle Heller, Joseph Heller, Leopold Heller, Brian Ubel, Sawako Ishihara, Marie Kaufer, Lawrence Korach, Harry Kashikow, Jacob Krug, Claire Lamb, Esther Lowasser, Ray Manasseh, William Matris, Sue Elaine Mazer, Joseph Michael, Bernard J. Duman, Jenny Newman, Maxine Papermaster, Gladys Paul